Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you The Last Best Friend by George Sims. This is copyright 1968 by Stein and Day. A little bit of trivia. The title is taken from a line from a poem by the Romantic poet Robert Southey. My name is Death, the last best friend am I. I just want to show you. I have the other half of the quote. So, my name is Death by Leslie Egan. The last best friend am I by George Sims. Leslie Egan is one of the pseudonyms also used by Del Shannon, and I'll review one of her books at a later date because I've got a bunch piled up on my shelf. So, The Last Best Friend original release isn't really done any favors by its cover. The lighting I'm seeing actually makes the colors pop more off this brown background, but that's because my office here is well lit. When the lights are not on bright, the cover gets kind of very muddy. You can see the black doesn't really hold well against this brown cover. And then the back cover is almost unreadable. It's so hard to read the black against the brown. So someone at the Stein and Day design department needed to take a closer look at this cover. A type cover can be really fascinating and well done and eye-catching. There are lots of them. But when they're not done well, they really do a book no favors. And I have to say, this jacket design is not one that can make me get up and cheer. But we can't judge a book by its cover, and The Last Best Friend is a good reason why. I really enjoyed this book quite a lot, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. There's not a lot of information about George Sims that I've been able to find. I don't think that he was, hugely successful. He wrote a handful of books. I wouldn't say they're particularly easy to find. They just sort of drop into bookstores once in a while, and so you're lucky if you can find one. I saw this one in a used bookstore, and I just read the jacket and I looked at the first page and I thought, okay, this seems kind of interesting. And it's been on my shelf, honestly, for a couple of years now, and I don't know, just it beckoned to me, and that's why I decided to read it. So this is the type of book that I actually am glad I read it at middle age rather than when I was younger. I think if I had read this book when I was a teenager or in my young 20s, I don't think it would have resonated quite as much. And that's because our lead character, Balfour, he's kind of going through a midlife crisis. That's too strong a term. Basically, he's an aging Lothario who, has left his wife because she's not exciting enough for him. He left his wife and his two youngest children. And he really is sampling the wares of, younger women. He's a charmer and he's good looking, so he has no trouble finding, bed partners. But as the book goes on, he's really starting to look at his life and what it is, and if bed hopping is really the way to happiness, and is it substituting for something more meaningful in his life. And he occasionally looks to the world, or looks at the world through this lens of a person who's no longer a spring chicken, and how one sees things differently. And, the middle-aged among us, those of us who are also heading into our senior years, know that with age comes wisdom if you're lucky and smart. And so that gave some nice depth to the character. In life, often these Lothario types are quite annoying, but like we've all known them, right? And I've thought, I can't believe women don't see through you a mile away because it's so obvious, right? But, they're out there and they're annoying, and you don't necessarily spend a lot of time around them because generally they don't really have male friends, right? They're so fixated on hooking up with the opposite sex that they, don't really have time for relationships beyond that. So the book opens with a very short chapter about a man who has terrible vertigo standing on a balcony, I shouldn't say a balcony, a ledge on a high floor of a building in London. And he falls. And the question that is to be answered in the book is, did he jump purposefully or was he pushed? So was this a suicide or a murder? Meanwhile, on the island of Corsica is our lead, Ned Balfour, and he's engaged in a meaningless but sexual little tryst with some cute little chippy. And in Corsica, I was really admiring the way Sims writes and observes and describes. I really felt like I was there. He really evoked a sense of a place that I don't know a lot about and made me wish that I could be there, except for the heat, because it sounds like it's a humid, sweaty mess. But other than that, it's great, but I just, personally, I'm not one for it, the heat and humidity. But it really made me think, Sims could have written for the, the travel bureau of Corsica. And I mentioned, that Balfour, the Lothario type, can be a bit annoying. But he gets a letter from a friend of his closest friend back home in London, saying, I really need to see you. I've got a terrible decision to make. And the friend is not dramatic. The friend is not, flighty. So Balfour takes it very seriously. And when he gets back to London, he finds out that his friend is dead. And he's very, he's very upset about this. And this is another thing about the narrator, the protagonist that worked for me, is that he doesn't begin an investigation because he's nosy or because the writer needs an excuse, for a plot or a lead character. He does it because he's truly fond of his friend and he wants to know what happened. And he's very saddened. He misses this guy. They were besties. And I like books like that. I like books where there's some sort of emotional attachment between the protagonist and the victim that causes the protagonist to say, I'm not just satisfied with really knowing nothing. I really want to find out what happened. And he does some investigating and he uncovers some interesting, bits and pieces. But he kind of hits a wall. He can't get any more information. He says, well, it's in the police's hands now. There's nothing more that I can do. Until he gets a call from an anonymous party saying, listen, I have some information for you. We've been asking questions. I can tell you more about what happened to your friend. So meet me at this remote location at a strange time and all will be revealed. So that's usually a plot device that annoys the hell out of me, right? If some stranger called you and said, meet me somewhere at 2:00 in the morning, would you go? No, you wouldn't. And that is a trope of mysteries, and I almost never find it I never, I don't find that it works usually. It usually takes me out of the story or makes me roll my eyes. But here, it made sense to me because of Balfour's friendship. He thinks someone is trying to help him, and that's why he goes to meet this person who proceeds to have him quasi beaten up and tells him to mind his own goddamn business. And of course, that only makes him more curious to find out what's going on. And eventually he gets to the bottom of it. The story is a good one, and it goes to some places based in recent world history, or at least recent world history when the book was published, and has some interesting outcomes. What most of the characters in this book do is dealing of precious works, whether manuscripts or art or china or dishware. They're all in that world of finding rarities and snatching them up and selling them to their clients, and making a buck in the process. And so you get to see some of that world, and that's fun. Our narrator is mostly a manuscript guy, but his friends are more in the art world. And something I really liked about this book is that a lot of the people and things being collected I had never heard of, right? So to me, this shows the author's deep knowledge of things. I mean, I'm not saying I know everything, but I've edited a bunch of art books and art history books in my career, and so I feel like I've got a really solid grounding in that type of education. And he just kept throwing out painters' names and poets' names that I just, English major, I thought I knew all the major poets, but I guess I know the major poets, but not all the minors. And so we threw out a lot of the minor poets. And I thought, wow, this man is really quite knowledgeable, and gave a lot of credibility to the book. So that was something I really enjoyed about it. And it's a fairly short book, about 180 pages. What's happened to the friend is revealed, and it's rather sad, but has pretty significant ramifications. I also want to say I really think George Sims was a very good writer. The writing was insightful and penetrating and lyrical in some places and thoughtful. I mean, it doesn't feel like this book was just dashed off, with artificial intelligence. It really feels like this was a book that was written and crafted, and care was taken with the words. And so I really found myself quite impressed by that. The only thing is, given, when you read books from earlier eras, which I do, you have to be ready for some social mores that you're not really, that we're kind of beyond or moving beyond now. And it struck me lately how even the most urbane of writers, intelligent, educated, really were very dismissive of gay men. I mean, there are a couple of throw-offs here, men as pansies, and I think that was the worst word that was used to describe them. But it was totally unnecessary. And I just thought, how horrible it must be to feel that you are, that you can be dismissed with one word and have nothing to you other than that one aspect of yourself. And so, I was slightly disappointed with Sims because I felt that he was a writer of understanding and and of sympathy for his characters, but not in the case of this one character who is kind of the stereotype of the killer gay or the violent gay. So that's, a little bit of a notch against it. But again, we read books from this era, we have to kind of overlook certain things. I come to find out that if you would like to read The Last Best Friend, it has been reissued by the British Library. So I think you could sign on to Amazon and get it and, have no trouble reading it and seeing whether you agree with what I've said in this video or not. What I'll say is I like the book enough to look for more by this author. I started it with maybe not high expectations, I admit, because the cover seemed so blah. And that can be a sign at a publishing house that the publisher isn't really that behind it, that maybe they had a very rich list that season and the editors wanted to push other books more. I mean, there's all these politics going on at publishing houses, and so you never really know. I mean, if I were the editor of this book, I would have not allowed this cover to go through. I would have said, we can do much better than that. But then you have to worry that the art director is going to be offended or the designer is going to feel that you're, not saying nice things about them. So politics, everywhere at every level of our lives and society. But like I said, despite the cover, I really did enjoy it. I enjoyed reading it. One other thing that I'll say that I thought was interesting is I was struck by the walking culture of London. The book does start in Corsica, but it's most of it takes place in London, which is a walking city, with, no discernible grid, right? It goes back to the year 1, right? And so the streets were not laid out in a grid pattern. And as I understand it, if you want to drive a taxi in London, you have to take a year training to figure out where, how to get where you want to go, because it's such a tangled mess of roads and an enormous traffic horror that makes New York City look like a walk in the park. And so you get this walking view of London that's, close to the ground. And Sims just makes you see the sorts of things that happen in the urban landscape that you would miss if you're just breezing by in a car or, sitting in a car as a passenger, thumbing your way on your cell phone and not really looking around you. And he sort of celebrates that walking culture, which I think is fabulous because, I know I need to walk more. I live in the suburbs. There's not a lot of sidewalks around here. But I have lived in New York City, and I did enjoy the walking aspect of it. And this book made me realize why devoted walkers and devoted urban dwellers love that aspect of living in the city, because it was pretty cool. So that's what I've got for you tonight. The Last Best Friend by George Sims. Grab yourself a copy on Amazon pretty easily if you'd like to read it. And when you're done, feel free to leave a comment here sharing your thoughts. Thank you, and I'll be back again next time.